This government is committed to securing nationwide coverage of gigabyte-capable broadband by 2025 because we know the benefits that world-class connectivity can bring. How we construct our 5G and full fibre public telecoms network has nothing to do with how we share classified data.
Britain is defying repeated pleas from the U.S., announcing it will give the Chinese firm Huawei some access to its next-generation 5G network. Canada is now the only member of the Five Eyes intelligence group that has yet to make a decision on Huawei. The Trump administration repeatedly warns its allies China could use Huawei to steal state secrets. Canada essentially has three options: ban the company from 5G, give it unfettered access, or take a page from Britain's book and allow Huawei limited participation. So is the company prepared for all three scenarios? Ali Khan Velshi is Vice President of Corporate Affairs at Huawei Canada. Hi, Mr. Velshi.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming in. Let me ask you. Let me start off by asking you what Britain decided today. Essentially, some access, but with caps on market access, like 35%. Would your company find that acceptable here in Canada?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, look, we welcome the decision, and in many ways, the British decision follows what we like to call the Canadian model of how Huawei has been allowed into the Canadian market for 4G LTE, which is in the radio access network, the cell phone towers, rather than the core. And so in many ways, the UK decision on 5G is quite similar to the Canadian decision on 4G from more than a decade ago. And as I said, we welcome that decision.
Except it adds those market caps, right? My understanding is that's the main difference. Right. So would your company be okay with market caps here in Canada?
I mean, I think that, like, I'm not going to discuss hypotheticals. I think that we've always told the government that we're prepared to meet any test, any burden that they have. Geographically, the UK is different than Canada. You know, we're more dispersed. The cost to connect is different. And so I think that it's not quite an apples to apples comparison on that issue.
Have you had any communication from the Canadian government as of late about the timing or nature of their decision?
Yeah, so look, we're in regular contact with the Canadian government, primarily at the officials level. We were again today to kind of discuss sort of some of the technical issues related to 5G. In terms of the timing, to be honest, your guess is as good as mine. I think that a number of government ministers came out today and said they're going to take the time to get the decision right, and I think that's a very responsible position, and we're completely comfortable with that.
When you say you're meeting with officials, what's the nature of those discussions? Is it simply technical? Is it about the future of 5G? What is the nature of those discussions?
It's mainly technical, right? It's explaining to them how our technology is evolving, the sort of the products that we have on offer, some of the steps we've taken to ensure cybersecurity resilience. There's just an ongoing dialogue that takes place, and part of the reason that takes place is because Huawei is already in the network in Canada for 4G LTE.
But are those conversations, I guess, aimed at assuring Canadian officials that they can make the decision to allow Huawei into 5G? Like, is it all about eventually 5G, or is this all separate?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair characterization. I think we see the 5G discussion and debate as an evolution of what's happening with 4G. And so part of the discussions we have with officials at kind of the technical level is to explain to them how that evolution sort of works on sort of an engineering basis.
There's a lot of pressure on Canada right now from our neighbors to the south to ban your company from entering 5G, primarily because they cite security concerns. And when they're talking about security concerns, the message they have for Canada and the government here is, don't trust this company. They are too closely aligned with the government in China, and we can't trust the government in China. What's your response to that?
I mean, I think that the UK decision is in many ways a repudiation of that argument. What we're seeing is that the Trump administration is going from country to country, US ally to US ally, essentially telling them, kick out Huawei or else. And for the most part, countries are saying no across Europe, across the G7, and now we have our first Five Eye ally.
New Zealand agreed.
That's true. You know, look, there's some countries that have taken that decision. New Zealand, Australia would be another, but the vast majority of Canada's allies, including in the G7, are and in Europe, are taking a different approach. They're taking a more balanced approach, similar to what we're seeing in the UK. And so I think that what you're finding is that President Trump is becoming increasingly isolated as the risks that he is citing are not being backed up by technical experts who are looking at the actual evidence.
So let's take President Trump out of the equation. Let's specifically look at the situation here in Canada. Canadian authorities arrested the CFO of your company, and in retaliation, the Chinese government detained 2 innocent Canadian men. Is that not understandable to you? Is it not understandable to you that Canadians would be very hesitant to trust your company?
I mean, I think that like what you're talking about is sort of the actions in many ways of the government of China, right? Which is not something that we're ever going to defend because that's for them to defend.
But they're taking
and
those actions based on something that happened to the CFO of your company, and you're trying to tell us, and I get your point, but that you're separate. You're not the Chinese government. That, in fact, and your CEO has said many times, we're not going to turn over things to the Chinese government, even if they tell us we have to.
You're never going to see anyone at Huawei defend the actions of the Chinese government or explain it. That's for the ambassador to do. Our position on the two Michaels is clear. We want to see them home as soon as possible. But in terms of these various decisions, whether it's Meng Wanzhou, which is before the courts, whether it's the diplomatic challenges that are existing between Canada and China, or whether it's Huawei and 5G, I think that all of these decisions should be taken on their own merits and addressed on their own merits. So in the same ways that Meng Wanzhou should be addressed in accordance with the rule of law in courts, we would say that the 5G decision should be made based on cybersecurity and technology, not politics.
I take that point, and I get what you're saying, kind of look at them all in isolation. But the truth is, they don't exist in isolation, right? In reality, you bring up the ambassador, for example. The former Canadian ambassador said, if Canada bans Huawei, there's going to be retaliation. There is a connection between whether you're saying there is one or not. The Chinese government obviously perceives a connection between your company and itself. Can you not understand how that would make Canadians or even the Canadian government hesitant to trust that Huawei, in fact, will not be nefarious in its actions through the 5G network?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair point, but it also illustrates the different perspectives between what the government of China has said and what Huawei has said. So whereas they've threatened retaliation, we've never ever said anything of that nature. In fact, we've said that regardless of whatever decision the government of Canada makes on Huawei and 5G, regardless of whether it's in our favor or not, we're going to continue to grow in Canada and we're going to continue to support our employees and our customers. And so, even on those issues where they have pronounced, the government of China has pronounced on our issues, we've taken a completely different tack.
But why would they be pronouncing on those issues if there was not a close connection between your company and the state?
Look, you'd have to ask them, right? I mean, I think that Huawei is a global company, operates in 170 countries. Yes, it was founded in China, and the bulk of our employees are in China. There may be many people in China who see it as a national champion, but certainly as sort of a global multinational conglomerate, we're just focused on the business. We're not focused on the politics of the issue.
I think maybe that's fair for you to say, but can you understand how it's impossible for Canadians to ignore the politics of the issue? 2 of our citizens have been arbitrarily detained in China.
I mean, I think that's fair and that's right. Canada has been dragged into the middle of this political dispute between President Trump or the U.S. and the government of China. We've been dragged in against our will, with consequences both for our economy and our citizens. And
how does the government ignore that, though? Like, you're asking the federal government here to ignore that, basically.
No, I'm not. I'm not asking them to ignore that. I'm asking that the issues that can be solved with diplomacy between government to government, diplomat to diplomat, should be solved diplomatically. But issues related to technology and the evolution of technology and how the future of the internet gets built, I don't think you can bundle all these issues together. I think you have to assess it on its own merits.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you, Mr. Velshi. Pleasure to have you here, as always.
Thanks for having me.
Alican Velshi, Vice President of Corporate Affairs at Huawei Canada.
We know how important it is to make sure that there is both competitiveness in the Canadian industry, but also security for Canadian users. That's why we're working with our Five Eyes allies, working with international partners, looking at the security concerns, and we will take the advice of our security experts on that.
Welcome back to Power and Politics with the Power Panel, Stockwell Day, Tim Murphy, Marcella Monroe, and Marika Walsh. Canada is the last of the Five Eyes countries to make a decision on whether or not to allow Huawei to be involved with the 5G network infrastructure in this country. The UK granted Huawei a limited role today in its 5G mobile network. Let's talk about how likely it is for Canada to follow suit. Tim, I'm going to start with you. Does this give Canada kind of an out where this ongoing decision is concerned?
Yeah, so let me first say that, we work at a law firm. We can't reveal who our clients are, but we may have a limitation on what we can say. But I can provide some analytic context. And that is, I think, in theory, it could provide some, political protection, if you can put it that way, to a Canadian decision to do something other than say no. But I think there is a real problem for Canada to say anything but no as long as the two Michaels are in custody in China. I think that is, saying yes to this in the context of them still being in custody in China is a political problem. We see the Conservative Party taking some strong views on this issue, and I think public opinion broadly is hardened against
Very
China.
much so, yeah. Since the two men were detained, yeah.
Yeah, and so I think, a yes or a kind of safety zone yes are a problem for a Canadian decision as long as the two Michaels are in custody.
Do you think that's true, politically speaking, Marcella? Do you think even a decision like the one the UK made, if it were to be made in this country, would be politically problematic for the Liberals?
Well, I think it is because we're kind of stuck between an extradition rock and a 5G hard space, right? Is what's going on here. And I think the other interesting thing to note is that while the Secret Service in the UK has said, we think this is controllable under limited circumstances to use this technology, they also said that partly because they recognize a hard fact that we have here in Canada to also grapple with, which is that in this particular vein of the 5G industry, there's really only 3 companies globally that can serve us. And so it is an economic challenge. And so one of the things the British government said today was, we need to find a way in this moment to start fixing what's a market problem. But on the other hand, I do agree, though. I think it's very difficult for us. We've been basically bullied by China for over a year. Those 2 men have been in custody. And we've basically been bullied by China for the last year because of the extradition decisions that we made. And so I think to say a yes, even a partial yes that Mr. Johnson was able to come up with today would be very challenging for the government. There's going to be a lot of pressure on them, though, to figure out how to get that technology in the door.
Stockwell, we had Alican Velshi on a few minutes ago, who's VP of Corporate Affairs for Huawei Canada, and his argument was, look, you've got to kind of separate these issues and judge them in isolation. So yes, there's a diplomatic problem between our two countries. Yes, they want the 2 Michaels returned, but evaluate this decision on the technological merits. Do you think that's actually possible for the federal government to do, though?
Yeah, that's actually the key point, and I'm glad you raised that. It is possible to use electronics to determine what types of equipment can in fact be loaded with bugs or not loaded with bugs. And so, as I always say when we discuss an issue related to Huawei, I am on the TELUS board, and we do use some Huawei equipment. And in fact, working with the Canada Security Establishment for over a dozen years on this very issue, just like you have means of putting electronics onto your engine to see if there's a problem, to see if there's certain things in there, to use x-rays, whatever it may be, it's equally as doable electronically on equipment. Now, the position in Canada with most, if not all of the telecoms, is that Huawei equipment is not in what we call the core, where there's any data storage. That's been our position. It seems like the UK has accepted that, as has most European countries. Germany just last year declared that they have the ability to tell what equipment might be at risk and what might not be. So you can prove it, you can be safe. I'm a Canadian, I want my grandkids protected, I want Canadian business protected, and I can determine that through technology. The other
in isolation of everything that's going on right now, like put your politician hat on, right? You've been in there, you've been around the table. Can you really make a decision like that, even if the technical, and I'm not an expert, but even if the technology, the merits are there and the bar is met, given the fact that 2 Canadians are arbitrarily detained, can you really make that decision?
It's a great question, and it's a decision I had to make in terms of when we had a pastor and his wife, the Garretts, imprisoned. Right. There were 2 Canadians, and there was no sense from the government at all that we'd be shutting down all business. Of course, the government, quite rightly, strongly spoke out against that, dealt publicly and privately, and did everything possible, and finally attained the release. A number of us worked even in the background on that. So when we have an issue with another country at the political level, it doesn't mean we should be shutting down necessarily, unless it gets, I don't know how bad it would get, but it doesn't mean we shut down. I mean, I have issues with a number of countries around the world that are not very nice to Canadians on the human rights side, but I haven't said in every case, let's stop dealing with them. Don't let Canadians buy and sell from that country. So I think there is a ground here for differentiation. They followed that in relation to the 2 Christian Canadians that were apprehended wrongly some time ago, and I think it's the course to take with this one. And let's face it, I'm one of the mass majority of Canadians who are not happy at all that we have 2 Canadians confined in China.
Marika, what do you think? I mean, especially from the government's, I guess, from the way in which the government might end up making this decision, are they able to parse the two out at this point?
I don't know how they parse the two out because, I mean, the minister last week even spoke to that. He said there are geopolitical considerations in making this decision, right? So they seem to think that you can't separate the two. And as Marcella said, it is a rock and a hard place because you have the fear of the reaction from the Chinese government at the same time that the reaction from the Trump administration is also not entirely known. It is possible that Boris Johnson's decision does give some cover for the Trudeau government, but I think that Boris Johnson and Donald Trump have a very different relationship, and I think that the UK has some different clout than Canada does with the US right now.
It's also, and to Stock's point, it's also not just like business as usual, right? This would be granting them increased access to the infrastructure for, a super fast network in this country. It's a decision that advances their posture in Canada,
Exactly.
not just keeps it status quo.
At the same time that we have this extradition issue, that we have these Canadians who are arbitrarily detained in China, and that we have these suggestions from the Chinese government that it's not separate from Huawei, that Canada's actions on Meng Wanzhou have led to economic pain exerted from China. So I think that these are very closely linked, and I do not envy Cabinet on this decision. I don't know how much longer, though, they can delay this decision.
We haven't made any final determination. Each country has their own assessments to make. We will make our own individual assessment. So I'm not going to jump to any conclusion of what that solution may look like vis-a-vis core or non-core. But the safety and security is going to be the underlying premise for the decision that we make.
Canada has a decision to make. Today, Britain defied repeated pleas from the U.S., announcing it will give the Chinese firm Huawei some access to its next-generation 5G network. Canada is now the only member of the Five Eyes intelligence group yet to make a final call on Huawei. The Trump administration has warned China could use Huawei to steal state secrets. So what should this country do? James Moore is a former Conservative Minister of Industry and now serves as a senior business advisor at Dentons. He joins us from Vancouver. Hi, Mr. Moore.
Hi.
So let me ask you that question. What should Canada do? Do you think it should follow suit with the UK? Should it allow partial access?
Well, we should have a principle-based policy, frankly, that transcends any one company or any one country. Right now, people are reacting to China and reacting to Huawei, these singular companies, or ZTE. But the reality is Canada should have a principle-based policy. And the first principle, of course, should be the protection of the privacy and security of Canada and of Canadians. The second principle should be that we should align ourselves with our largest trading partners and allies around the world, the Five Eyes countries. And the Five Eyes, of course, are now apparently split on this. And we should also look at our largest trading partners and our G7 allies. And of course, the third principle as well is that we should make sure that Canada is not left behind in the 5G revolution that is coming up. And so those principles sometimes conflict with one another, but it should be a principle-based approach, an evidence-based approach that it transcends any one individual company or any one individual country. And unfortunately, it seems a little bit like the world, and certainly, frankly, media and the conversation about this is chasing around the conversation about Huawei as a particular company rather than what should Canada's policy be on a go-forward basis.
Is it, let me play devil's advocate for a second, is it because of everything that's gone on, obviously, over the last year that the focus very much, I mean, aside from the fact that we hear from the president all the time that Canada should be banning this or other allies should be banning this, but is it because the conversation is so much centered on what happened to Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor and that it involved that company's CFO? Like, is that the reason that instead of this principled approach that you're describing, everyone is very much focused on this singular case?
Yeah, and certainly the dynamic is clouded, and that certainly makes the decision that Minister Baines and the Government of Canada has to make a difficult one. You know, we faced a similar challenge, although it wasn't quite as hot at the time back when we were in government, and in 2008 was when Huawei actually first came to Canada, and as Stockwell Day said in the previous segment, that Huawei equipment is here now. TELUS is using it, Bell is using it, Rogers has used it, but it has been in place in Canada for quite some time, and these concerns have been around for quite some time. In 2014, we put forward a policy for having a pre-screening of this kind of equipment and a disclosure to the Government of Canada and an engagement with the Government of Canada to try to regulate this equipment as it came in. Now, of course, with 5G, one of the real questions that has to be brought forward, and Minister Rabb in Westminster in London today, and when he made his policy announcement, he said, you know, why is it that the world is in a place here where there may well be a market failure? We have this rise of 5G, this incredible economic opportunity worth trillions of dollars around the world, and yet there seems to be market failure with the delivery of this kind of equipment. Why is that the case, and
Why
how
do you
long
think
will it
it's the
take?
case?
Well, I don't know, and it's a bit of a curiosity. I mean, perhaps it's not obviously as economically lucrative as some may think it is. But if it's a market failure to develop this kind of equipment, deploy it in an economy as tight and constrained as the UK or the European market, you can imagine Canada, second largest country in the world in size, 37th largest in population. This is something that we really should be worried about, because we do want to make sure that all Canadians do have full advantage of the 5G opportunity when it comes, so that people who are economically and geographically and socially isolated in this country, that they're all drawn in and have the ability to participate in the 5G economy. So we really are juggling a lot of stresses and dynamics here that are at play. And so if we're just going to sort of have a hot decision based on contemporary headlines about Huawei and say we're going to ban this one company without having a principled approach on a go-forward basis, then we could be boxing ourselves in and losing out on the 5G opportunity.
How much of a challenge is it, and given your experience in that role, when you have our closest ally telling us specifically what they think we should do, and if we don't, there could be repercussions in intelligence sharing?
Well, I think we're actually in a kind of an interesting spot here because we do have the tensions with China, with the two Michaels who are in prison in China, and of course the extradition case with Meng Wanzhou, and then now the UK has gone forward with this sort of a mixed policy, right? They're banning it from the core, they're banning it from the government, they're allowing it in the private sector up to a maximum of 35%. But even the Conservative Party is split. When Minister Rabb in the UK was making this announcement, Ian Duncan Smith, a former leader of the Conservative Party, came up and criticized the government on this sort of hybrid solution. And now, of course, the United States will react to this solution. So in some ways, there's a bit of a virtue here in patience, because 5G is not going to be something that gets turned on overnight. It's something that's going to be realized probably in the next 24 to 36 months, but it's not going to happen overnight. So we've seen now what the UK has done. We've seen what the other Five Eyes countries have done. We've seen largely what the G7 thinks rhetorically, but now we have some actual ink on a paper, and the Americans will react to it, and we'll see what their reaction is. But for Canada, still, of course, the first principle is always protect Canada, protect Canadians, and ensure that our policy is not, cat chasing its tail after one particular company and one particular country. It should be a principled approach that protects Canadians, while still making us a real landing spot for 5G technology going forward.
On this particular decision, though, do you think there is sort of like a clicking clock, or ticking clock rather, for Canada, given what you just outlined?
I think there's pressure, but I suspect that the government will still have some time, and I don't think it's a matter of days or weeks, but probably months. But the pressure will continue to go forward. But it is clouded by this dynamic of Meng Wanzhou. And let's not forget as well, China is Canada's second largest trading partner. Yes, still 2/3 of our exports go to the United States. The new NAFTA, it's our most important market, and it's our most important diplomatic and economic relationship, no question. But China is still our second largest trading partner, and we do have 300,000 Canadians living in Hong Kong. We have 400,000 Hong Kong residents living in Canada. This is a complicated relationship, and we shouldn't just be sort of reflexively anti one company or one country. Again, principled policy-based approach that protects Canadians and allows us to participate in 5G. That's what we need.
Have you seen any evidence, though, that, and I'm not trying to criticize, one government or other, but have you seen any evidence here that there will be that kind of approach? I mean, I just feel like the conversation is so focused, understandably because of what's happened over the past year, on Huawei, on the relationship with China. Like, do you see any avenue for departure from that, for that kind of principled approach that you're describing?
Well, I think so, because, as I said, our G7 partners and Five Eyes countries have now all made public declarations. The comments thus far by Minister Baines and Prime Minister Trudeau have so far been pretty nuanced and pretty vague, which is not a bad place to be in. So now we've essentially have everybody's opinions in front of us, and so we can sort of measure twice and cut once and be very thorough in terms of our approach to this. What I would think Canadians would like to see would be a ministerial statement in Parliament by Minister Baines sometime in the next month or so, where he stands up and makes a broad, full-throated, substantive presentation on where Canada is at in terms of cybersecurity, 5G, the way forward, and what the sort of vision is for Canada for the next 5 years. We know technologically where the world is going broadly in the next 5 years in terms of these infrastructure demands and needs. What is Canada's position? What are its principles? What are we learning from our trading and security partners around the world? And how are we going to approach it? And I think you can get a cross-partisan, thoughtful debate about how to do this, and I think the government should seize this opportunity.
Before I let you go, if you don't mind, I'd love to ask you just a quick question about the Conservative leadership race. Are you supporting anybody, given your history with the party?
I'm not supporting anybody right now, but I think, certainly both Peter MacKay and Aaron O'Toole are fantastic candidates. I think, if I'm blunt, I think both of them are improvements over our previous leader, and I think both of them would make fine prime ministers of this country.
Can I ask you if you think the withdrawal, or the announcements, I should say, from Pierre Poilievre, Rona Ambrose, Jean Charest, do you think that's to the detriment of the race, or are you okay with the sort of state of it?
I think more choice, the better, but they all have their individual reasons for not running. But those candidates who are left in the race, particularly Peter and Aaron, again, two fine, experienced former ministers with parliamentary experience, private sector experience. I think we are, the party's in very good hands with both of them as candidates. The more choice, the better, but the choices we have are pretty impressive.
And just one more before I let you go, because I saw you tweet last week about that candidate, Richard Descaries, who said that being gay is a choice. Do you think he should be allowed to run?
I don't know. Look, I'd be surprised, frankly, if he pulls together the funds that are necessary. But I think if he runs, I think that's also an opportunity. It's an opportunity for the broad, vast majority of Conservatives and Canadians to join the party and vote intentionally with their hearts in their forethought of their approach, and just say, and rejecting that kind of thoughts about people's private lives. The government has no business in the bedrooms of the nation. The government has no business, and politicians have no business making judgments about people's private lives and their sexual orientation or background. Love is love. Leave people alone. Enjoy your life and do good work. That would be my advice to Mr. Descaries.
All right, I'm going to leave it there. Thanks a lot for your insights this evening, Mr. Moore. Pleasure to have you on the show as always.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.